My family told me I would never amount to anything. They called me a failure and cut me out of their lives right when I needed them most. Years later, when their entire world came crashing down, they came knocking on my door, begging for the one thing I had that they'd lost: success. They thought they were asking for a handout, but they had no idea they were responsible for creating the very person they now needed to save them. This is the story of how their cruelty became the fuel for my success, and how karma delivered a message they couldn't possibly ignore. If you've ever been underestimated or made to feel small, this one's for you. Hit that subscribe button because you won't want to miss this journey. It's strange how memory works. When I look back at the before times, it's like looking at a warm, faded photograph from someone else's life. We weren't perfect, but on the surface, we were the picture of suburban happiness. My father, a stern, proud man, had built a respectable construction company from the ground up. Hamilton and Sons Construction. The name itself was a promise, a legacy. My mother was the family's social glue, a woman who cared more about appearances and community standing than anything else. And then there was my brother, David. David was the firstborn, the son, in Hamilton and Sons. He was 2 years older, and from the second he could walk, it was clear he was the heir apparent. He had our father's easy charm and our mother's social grace. Life just seemed to work out for him. He collected praise and awards like it was his birthright. He was the golden child, and I was just the shadow he cast. They weren't openly cruel to me at first. It was more of a quiet, constant indifference. My achievements got a polite nod. David's were celebrated with expensive dinners. My straight A report cards in things like physics and calculus would be pinned to the fridge for a week, only to be replaced by a blurry photo of David shaking hands with some local official at a golf tournament. He was being groomed for leadership. I was just there. My passion was different. While David was learning to read blueprints for houses he'd one day build, I was fascinated by the invisible forces that powered them. I was obsessed with efficiency, with systems, with creating something from pure logic. I spent my teens building basic computers, writing code, and dreaming of a future in tech, a field my father openly called playing with toys. Real men build things you can stand on, things that will last, he'd say, clapping David on the back. Not this invisible nonsense in a box. Still, I tried. God, I tried so hard to earn my place. I worked summers on Dad's construction sites, hauling lumber and mixing concrete in the blistering heat. I'd come home exhausted, hoping for one word of approval. Instead, I'd find David in the air-conditioned office, with his feet on the desk, laughing with our father about a missed putt. My sweat was invisible. His potential was all they saw. I told myself it was a test. If I just worked hard enough, if I could prove my interests had real value, they'd have to see me. I went to college and majored in computer engineering, a choice my father met with a resigned sigh. At least it's engineering, he'd said, as if it were a lesser, embarrassing version of the real work David was doing by getting a business degree. I poured everything into my studies for 4 years, driven by a desperate need for their validation. I kept picturing the day I'd come home with a brilliant tech idea that could revolutionize their business, a logistics program to streamline deliveries, or software for energy-efficient building plans. I had a dozen ideas, each one a peace offering I hoped they'd finally accept. My senior year, I developed software for my thesis project. It analyzed architectural plans and suggested modifications for optimal energy efficiency, calculating long-term cost savings for the homeowner. It was niche and complex, but it was brilliant. It even won a university-wide innovation award. I remember calling home, my voice shaking with excitement, the small glass trophy in my hand, feeling like a bar of gold. My mother answered. "Oh, that's nice, dear," she said, her voice totally distracted. "Listen, can I call you back? We're just heading out. David just closed his first big solo contract for the company, and your father is taking us all out to celebrate." Click. I just stood there in my dorm room, the silence buzzing in my ears. The trophy suddenly felt cheap and light. It was never about my success. It was about my failure to be David. That was the moment the warm colors of my childhood memories faded to a harsh, unforgiving gray. I realized the seat at the table I was fighting for was never meant for me. It had been reserved from the start, and I was just the ghost at the feast, watching them toast a future I was never going to be a part of. After college, I came home with a degree and a chip on my shoulder, but also with that same foolish hope. I turned down a good job offer from a tech firm because I still believed I could prove my worth from the inside. I took a low-level project management job at Hamilton & Sons, determined to make them see. For 2 years, I tried. I digitized their entire inventory system, saving them thousands. I introduced scheduling software that cut project timelines by 15%. I formally presented my energy efficiency program to my father and David. My father just stared at the screen, looking confused and impatient. David just smirked. "It's clever, little brother," David said, leaning back in his chair. "But our clients aren't looking for a science project. They want an extra bathroom and a 3-car garage. You're trying to solve a problem nobody thinks they have." My father just nodded. "Leave the business to us, son. Stick to your computers." It was a constant uphill battle. My contributions were absorbed without a word, my ideas dismissed without a thought. Meanwhile, David was promoted to vice president, his main qualification being his last name. He'd make risky, ego-driven decisions, overbidding on contracts, using flashy, expensive materials, and my father would praise his bold vision. When those decisions led to cost overruns, it was my job to clean up the mess and find savings to balance the books. I was the silent janitor for my brother's glorified mistakes. The breaking point came when I was 26. I'd been working on a side project for over a year, pouring my heart and soul into it. I had developed a proprietary process for a new type of building material, a composite panel made from recycled plastics and industrial waste. It was incredibly strong, lightweight, waterproof, and way cheaper to produce than traditional timber and drywall. It was a game changer. I drained my entire savings, about $20,000, to get a prototype and a provisional patent. I knew this was it. This wasn't invisible nonsense in a box. It was a tangible product. It was the future. I booked another formal meeting. This time, I had a full-sized panel, engineering reports, and cost analysis sheets showing it could boost their profit margins by 30%. I laid it all out on the boardroom table. My father picked up a piece, his brow furrowed. David circled the table like a shark. "So, what is this?" David asked, his voice already dismissive. "It's our new core product," I said, my heart pounding. "I'm calling it Apex Panel. We can set up a small manufacturing line for an initial investment of about $250,000. We'd make that back in 18 months and become industry leaders in sustainable building." My father looked from the panel to the financials, then to David. I saw a flicker of calculation in his eyes. He was waiting for his chosen son to give the verdict. David laughed. A short, sharp, ugly sound. 250 grand? For your little plastic and trash project? Are you insane? "It's not trash, David," I said, my voice tight. "It's a viable product. This could secure the company's future for the next 50 years. "The future of this company is secured," David shot back, his voice turning cold. "It's secured by the contracts I've won. It's built on a reputation for quality, not for gimmicks made out of garbage." He turned to my father. "Dad, he's asking us to bet the company on a fantasy. I, on the other hand, have a real opportunity. The new luxury development, Willow Creek Estates. Landing it would make us. It just requires a $300,000 bond to show we're liquid." My father looked at me, then at David. The choice was already made. "I'm sorry, son," my father said, his voice flat, not even looking me in the eye. "The company's money is tied up. We're backing David's play." The air just went out of my lungs. "You won't even consider it? You'll spend $300,000 on a bond for one risky contract, but you won't invest in a product that could change the whole business?" That's when my mother, who'd been silent in the corner, spoke up. Her words were the final blow. "Honestly, honey," she said, with a fake sympathy that was worse than scorn, "maybe it's time you stopped these hobbies. David is the businessman. You're the clever one with computers. Why don't you stick to what you're good at? This is out of your depth. We can't afford your failures." Your failures. The words just hung there. It wasn't a rejection of my idea. It was a rejection of me. Every late night, every summer I'd toiled, every ounce of effort was for nothing. They didn't see an innovator. They saw a liability. I looked at their faces. My father's stony disappointment, my mother's condescending pity, and David with a smug, triumphant smirk that just said, "I win. I always win." I slowly packed up my materials. My hands were shaking, but when my voice came out, it was unnervingly calm. "Fine," I said, without looking at them. "I'll do it myself." David snorted. "Good luck with that. Let us know how it works out when you're filing for bankruptcy." I walked out of that boardroom, out of the building, and out of their lives. I didn't go back to my desk. I just got in my car and drove, the words echoing in my head. "We can't afford your failures." They hadn't just refused my idea. They had officially, finally, written me off. They held up my ambition, weighed it against my brother's, and declared me worthless. It wasn't business. It was a verdict on my life. The first few months were a free-fall. The calm I felt walking out of that boardroom just evaporated, replaced by humiliation and despair. I had no job, no savings, and the people I'd spent my life trying to please hadn't just shut the door on me. They'd bolted it. They never called. Not once. It was like I'd just ceased to exist. I moved into a dingy one-room rental on the industrial side of town. The silence in that room was deafening. My days were a blur. I applied for dozens of engineering jobs, but my heart wasn't in it. My confidence was shot. Their voices were on a loop in my head. Failure, out of your depth. Maybe they were right. I ran out of money fast. I sold my car just to make rent. My diet was instant noodles and cheap coffee. I was wasting away. This was rock bottom, and it was a cold, lonely place. One rainy afternoon, sitting in that miserable room, staring at the Apex panel prototype, something else flickered inside me. It wasn't despair. It was anger. A hot, clarifying rage. How dare they? They wanted me to be a failure? Fine. I would burn that failure as fuel. That day, the wilderness stopped being a place of exile and became my training ground. The pain wasn't a weight anymore. It was a whetstone. No bank would give me a loan. So, I took any work I could find. I delivered pizzas at night. By day, I worked as a freelance IT consultant for small businesses. Every spare dollar and every waking moment went into Apex. My tiny apartment became a lab. I bought used equipment from scrapyards. A mixer, a compression mold. I spent nights experimenting with different formulas. The acrid smell of burning plastic filling the room. That's the smell of pure determination to me now. That's when I met George. He owned a small machine shop where I had a part-time job cleaning floors. He was in his late 60s, with calloused hands and eyes that saw everything. He noticed me staying late, tinkering. One evening, he walked over. "What's all this, kid?" I was defensive, expecting more ridicule. But he had a kind look, so I told him everything. The material, my family, the betrayal. He listened patiently. When I finished, he tapped the panel. "This is good," he said simply. "Strong, smart." He looked me right in the eye. "Your family, they're fools, but a fool's curse can be a wise man's blessing." George became the father I never really had. He saw potential in me. He let me use his workshop, taught me about machinery, and introduced me to his network. He was my first believer, and his belief was the scaffolding I needed to rebuild myself. With George's help, I perfected the Apex panel. I sent new samples to independent labs, using my pizza delivery money. The results were even better than I'd hoped. The material exceeded industry standards. Armed with official certifications, I started again. I didn't go to banks. I went straight to small, independent builders. Most brushed me off, but a few, tired of rising lumber costs, were intrigued. My first sale was for a tiny backyard shed. The builder, Mike, was skeptical but desperate. I delivered the panels myself in a beat-up truck George let me borrow and even helped him install them. A week later, Mike called, ecstatic. The shed was the sturdiest thing he'd ever built, and it cost him 40% less. He placed a larger order. Then he told another contractor, and that contractor told two more. It started as a trickle, then a stream. I officially incorporated as Apex Innovations. For the first year, I was the entire company: CEO, manufacturer, salesman, delivery driver, and janitor. I worked 18-hour days, 7 days a week. Sleep was a luxury. But for the first time in my life, I felt a purpose that was all my own. The wilderness had been harsh, but it had stripped away everything that wasn't essential. It took my pride and my comfort. In their place, it gave me resilience. My family tried to bury me, but they didn't realize they had planted a seed. And in the dark, something was finally starting to grow. The next 5 years were a blur of exhilarating growth. Word of mouth for Apex panels was explosive. The construction industry was being squeezed by lumber prices and a demand for sustainable options. My plastic and trash project was suddenly being called revolutionary. Going from a one-man show to a real company was one terrifying leap of faith after another. I finally secured a small business loan from a local credit union that cared more about my sales record than my family name. With that money, I leased a warehouse and hired my first 2 employees. Seeing our first Apex Innovations truck pull out of the loading bay was more emotional than any award had ever been. It was real. It was mine. George officially came on as my head of operations. We reinvested every penny, focusing on R&D. We created new versions of the panel: fire retardant, insulated, even decorative ones. We weren't just a cheaper alternative anymore. We were a superior one. Our big break came 3 years in. A major architectural firm signed a multi-million-dollar deal with us to be the exclusive supplier for a huge eco-friendly housing development. Overnight, Apex Innovations was on the map. We were featured in trade magazines. "The future of building is recycled," one headline read. I started getting calls from national distributors, the same companies my father had spent his life trying to impress. The success was dizzying, but I never forgot the wilderness. I ran my company with the lessons I'd learned from the ground up. Treat employees with respect, pay them well, and listen to every idea. By the 5th year, Apex Innovations was a force. We had over 150 employees, a state-of-the-art facility, and a valuation nearing 9 figures. My personal life had transformed too. I bought a penthouse loft downtown, not for luxury, but because the light and open space felt like the exact opposite of that dark, cramped room where my journey began. I found peace, a quiet confidence that came from knowing I had built this life on my own terms. I rarely thought about my family. I'd hear whispers that Hamilton and Sons had won the contract for Willow Creek Estates. It was their big gamble. I never felt the need to gloat. My success wasn't about proving them wrong anymore. It was about proving myself right. The ascent wasn't just about building a company. It was about rebuilding a man. It was a Tuesday afternoon, 6 years after I'd walked out of their lives. My assistant buzzed me. "There's a David Hamilton here to see you," she said, her voice hesitant. "He doesn't have an appointment." I felt a cold, clinical curiosity. I had imagined this moment 1,000 times. Now that it was here, it felt strangely quiet. "Send him in," I said. The man who walked into my office was not the brother I remembered. The smug swagger was gone. His expensive suit hung loosely on his frame. His face was pale, his eyes etched with a weary desperation I'd never seen before. He looked small. He stopped in the middle of the room, looking around. He looked at the bustling factory floor through the glass, at the awards on my shelves, and then at me. "My God," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "It's all true." It was a bizarre admission. They'd been hearing rumors, but actually believing it was another story. "What do you want?" "David?" I asked, keeping my tone neutral. He straightened his tie, a flicker of his old arrogance returning. "We need to talk. It's about Hamilton and Sons." I just waited. The facade crumbled. "We're in trouble," he admitted. "Bad trouble." He told me the whole story. The Willow Creek project had been a catastrophe. David, in his arrogance, had cut corners on materials to boost profits. He'd ignored geological surveys and used a cheap, inadequate foundation treatment. 2 years later, the foundations of several luxury homes began to fail. Lawsuits poured in. The reputation of Hamilton and Sons was destroyed. Their insurance wouldn't cover negligence. They were forced to liquidate assets to pay settlements. They lost everything. My father, defeated and broken, had been forced into retirement. Their failure was a direct result of their own hubris. "We have one last chance," David said, his eyes pleading. "A potential investor. But they're only interested if we can show them we're retooling with modern sustainable methods. They want to see innovation." I saw the punchline coming. 6 years in the making. "They mentioned you," David said, the words barely audible. "They mentioned Apex Innovations. They said if we could secure a partnership with you, they'd consider a buyout. It would be enough to pay off the debts, to give Mom and Dad something to live on." I leaned back in my chair. The universe, it seemed, had a flair for the dramatic. They needed my name. They needed my innovation. They needed the very thing they had mocked and cast out. My failure was their only salvation. "So, let me get this straight," I said, my voice dangerously soft. "After calling my life's work a plastic and trash project, after telling me I was a failure, after letting me walk away without a single call to see if I was dead or alive, you're here in my office asking me to lend my company's name to save yours?" He flinched. "I know how it looks," he stammered. "We were wrong. I was wrong. We didn't understand." "No, you understood perfectly," I countered, my voice colder still. "You understood that you were the chosen one and I was the disposable one. This isn't about a lack of understanding, David. It's about character." He stood there, speechless. "We're family," he finally choked out, the last resort of a desperate man. The word family hung in the air, a bitter, twisted joke. This was the moment, quiet, devastating, and complete. The rejected son, now the gatekeeper. The golden child, now the beggar. The failure, now the arbiter of their fate. I held all the power they once held over me, and the silence was the sound of the scales finally balancing. I let his last word, family, hang in the air. I looked at my brother, this shell of a man, and I felt nothing. The anger that fueled me for so long had burned out. The pain was just a scar. I didn't feel a need for revenge, only a need for closure. I stood and walked to the window, looking down at my factory floor. I saw people working with purpose. I saw George, my mentor, laughing with a young engineer. This was my family now. The one I built. Forged in loyalty and respect, not in blood and betrayal. I turned back to David. My voice was calm, steady, and finally free. "Family," I repeated softly. "Family doesn't do what you did. A family doesn't call one of their own a failure. They don't watch someone struggle and offer only silence. They don't build one son up by tearing the other one down. You didn't want a family, David. You wanted a dynasty." I walked back to my desk and sat down. The answer is no. The 2 words were quiet, but they landed like a wrecking ball. David staggered, his face draining of all color. "No?" he whispered. "But you have to. For Mom and Dad. They'll have nothing. They made their choice 6 years ago," I stated, my voice unwavering. "They invested in your ego, not in my innovation. Investments have consequences. This is the consequence of their choice. They will have to live with it, and so will you. He started to ramble about forgiveness and second chances, but I held up a hand. This isn't about revenge, David. I'm not doing this to punish you. I'm doing this to protect what I've built. My company, my reputation, the livelihoods of my 150 employees, they were built on integrity. I will not risk that by tying it to the toxic legacy of Hamilton and Sons. Your company failed because its leadership was flawed. Nothing has changed. I stood up, signaling the end. I wish you the best in navigating your debts, I said, the formal words a clearer dismissal than any insult. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have a business to run. He stared at me, his eyes wide with a horrifying understanding. He was truly seeing me for the first time, not as his little brother, but as a stranger who had just declined to save him. He turned and walked out of my office without another word. As the door closed, I felt a profound release. It wasn't the joy of winning. It was the quiet, powerful peace of a war finally being over. They had called me a failure, and maybe, by their definition, I was. I had failed to be the son they wanted. I had failed to fit into the box they built for me. And that failure was the greatest success of my life. In the end, I learned that sometimes the people who are supposed to believe in you will be the ones who doubt you the most. Their rejection can feel like a death sentence, but it can also be your liberation. It forces you to find your own strength, to define your own success. The best revenge isn't watching your enemies fall. It's building a life so true to yourself that their opinion no longer matters. And family isn't always the blood you share. It's the people who show up and lift you up. What would you have done in my situation? Would you have helped them? Let me know in the comments below. And if this story resonated with you, make sure to subscribe for more stories about overcoming the odds. Thanks for listening.